Percent. We've all heard and used numbers given as a percent of something, but what does this actually mean? Well, percent means out of 100. So for example, on the grid to the left, if we want to fill in 16 out of the 100 squares, we can do that. So first of all, I want you to cross out the bottom row. There's an extra row in this grid. So now we have 100 squares and we want to fill in 16 of those squares. So I want to fill in one entire column. That's 10. And then I want to fill in 6 more. So now I filled in 16 squares in this grid. This can be written as a fraction, 16 out of 100. We can also think about writing this as a decimal number. So each of these squares represents 1/100th. So if we think back to place value in grade 9, we learned about the place values of decimal numbers. So the first place is the 10th, and then we have the hundredths. So that can be written as 0.01. So this is your 10th, your 0 is in the 10th place, and your 1 is in the hundredths place. So 16% can also be written as either 16 over 100, which is as a fraction, or it can be written as 0.16. So that's a decimal number. So we can express 16% as a fraction by writing it over 100, or we can express it as a decimal number, which is 0.16. So how do we turn 16% into a decimal number, into 0.16, without having to draw a grid and maybe without having to write it as a fraction first? Well, percent also means per 100. So the word per, you should think about as the operation being division. So what is the rule for dividing by 100? So dividing by 100, we want to think about taking that decimal place and we move it 2 spots to the left. So I'm finding my decimal point in 16% and I'm moving it 2 spots to the left. So then it becomes 0.16. Always include that 0 in front of your decimal place. So let's go ahead and try some more examples. So 24%, I'm finding that decimal place and I'm moving it 2 spots to the left to become 0.24. 32.5%, find that decimal place, move it 2 spots to the left, 0.325. 8%, find that decimal place, move it 2 spots to the left. If there is no number, enter in that 0. So 0.08. So you can do this using the mental math skills, or you could use your calculator if that's an easier strategy for you. So find your decimal place, move it 2 spots to the left. So 0.0625. 250, find that decimal place, move it 2 spots to the left, 2.50. You can keep the 0 at the end, or you could just write it as 2.5. Both of those answers would be acceptable. And lastly, 0.5%, find that decimal place, move it 2 spots to the left. We get 0.005. So now let's think about the opposite. So what if I was trying to go from a decimal number to a percentage? Well, then I would just multiply by 100. Remember when I multiply by 100, I move my decimal place 2 spots to the right. So look for that decimal place, move it 2 spots to the right, so it becomes 24%. And you're going to do that for all of these in this column. So 0.08, move that decimal place 2 spots to the right, becomes 8%. You don't have to write the zeros in front of the numbers. 2.5, move it 2 spots to the right. If there is no extra number there, put in that 0, so 250%. 1.23 turns into 123%. 0.03, move that decimal place through 2 spots to the right. It becomes 3%. So don't forget to write that percent symbol if it's not given to you. 3.8 becomes 380%. So add a 0 to those blank spots. 0.7, move it 2 spots, becomes 70%. So don't forget to add those little zeros in those blank spaces if you need to. You can even add it up in here as well. 0.325, move that 2 spots to the right, becomes 3.25%. 0.0625 becomes 6.25%. Again, we don't have to put the zeros in front of the number, and only unless there is no digit in front of the decimal place. 0.005, bring that over 2 spots. So this is where we need to keep that 1 0 in front, so 0 decimal point at 0.5%. 0.45 becomes 45%. 0.116 becomes 11.6%. So don't forget that percent symbol if it's not there. 0.004 becomes 0.4%. And lastly, 0.012. Find that decimal place, move it 2 spots to the right. It becomes 1.2%. So now that we've taken a look at how to convert between percents and decimal numbers and vice versa, let's add in the other one. So let's put it all together. So recall that fractions, decimals, and percents all describe some part of a whole. So in the first part of this lesson, we practiced how to convert percents into decimal numbers. Okay, so in this part of the lesson, though, we are going to learn how to convert fractions to any of these types of numbers, to any other type of numbers. So the word convert means to change, so keep that in mind. So the previous page, we looked at converting percents into decimal numbers, and now we're going to add in fractions. So there's one word that you need to know about changing from fractions into decimals, and that word is division. 3/4 means 3 divided by 4. And you can take your calculators if you want to do these calculations. 3 divided by 4 is 0.75. 17/25 means 17 divided by 25. And again, you're just going to take that calculator. 17 divided by 25 is 0.68. And next, we're going to see how we change from a percent to a fraction. So remember that 45%, so remember that word percent means per 100, right? Per 100. So that means it's 45 per 100. So 45 over 100. And in order to write this as our fraction as our final answer, we have to reduce it. So we have to put it into lowest terms. And we already took a look at how to put fractions in lowest terms in a previous lesson. So we're going to look for the greatest common factor. We're going to look for the number that will divide evenly into both 45 and 100. And that number is 5. And when we divide both of these numbers by 5, we get 9/20. So you are welcome to use any strategy that we looked at in those previous lessons. So showing that you're dividing by 5, or you can use your ABC button if you have that on your scientific calculator. For the next one, we have 64. 64% is the same as 64/100. We're also going to put that into lowest terms, and we can do that by dividing by 4. So we're dividing both our numerator and our denominator by 4. And that gives us 16/25. So now that we've spent some time taking a look at how we convert from fractions now to percents and fractions to decimals, now let's put them all together and complete the chart below. So what we want to do is we want to think about what do we have first. So the first example, we have a fraction. The easiest thing to think about is to move that fraction into a decimal number first. So 3 divided by 5 is the same as 0.6. So to go from a fraction to a decimal, you're dividing. And then to go from a decimal to a percent, we want to multiply by 100. And 0.6 times 100 is 60%. So we're going to use that same strategy for the next one. So 5/8 is the same as 5 divided by 8, which is 0.625. And we're going to times that by 100 to give us 62.5%. Now we want to think about going from a percentage now. So the next two examples deals with a percentage first. So in order to go from a percent to a decimal number, we want to divide by 100. So 50% is the same as 0.5 or 0.50. Either one of those would be perfectly fine. Okay, so 0.50, or you could write 0.5. And then how do we go from a decimal to a fraction? Well, this is where we have to think about place value. So in grade 9, we looked at place value. And again, we looked at what is this last, when we're thinking about converting from a decimal to a fraction, we want to think about what our last digit is. Where is that in terms of place value? So this is in the hundredths position. So if we have two numbers, this is your 10th, this is your hundredths. So we're going to place our 50/100. And then we have to put that into lowest terms. So 50/100 is the same as 1/2. You might already know that 0.5 is the same as 1/2, but if you want to think about place values for those ones that are a little bit more complicated than that, then that's how you would solve that. So let's take a look at the next one. So we have 32%. Changing that into a decimal number, so divide by 100, gives us 0.32. And then again, we want to look at this place value. This is in the hundredths position. So I'm going to start by putting 32/100. And then I want to put this into lowest terms. So I want to divide both of these by the same value to get 8/25. So we're dividing both of these numbers by 4. And then the last couple of rows, we're looking at changing a decimal number into either a percent or a fraction. So let's go back to a fraction. So remember, this is in terms of place value. So what place value is that last digit in? That's in your hundredths place value. So we're going to put 85 over 100. And then we're going to find a number that will divide evenly into both of the numerator and the denominator. In our case, it'll be 5. And our answer in lowest terms would be 17 out of 20, or 17 over 20. And from a decimal number to a percent, we times by 100. So we move that decimal place 2 spots to the right to give us 85%. And then the last one, again, we want to look at that place value and that very last digit. So our number here is going to be 5 over 100, because I don't have to worry about the 0 in front, so just 5 over 100. And again, I want to find a number that will divide evenly into both the numerator and the denominator. That's 5, so I get 1 over 20. And then timesing it by 100, or moving that decimal place 2 spots to the right, gives me 5%. If you have any questions about converting between fractions, decimals, or percents, please reach out, send me an email, or sign up for a virtual help session, and I will see you in the next lesson.